I'm Andreas Enfeldt from dietdoctor.com, and I'm here with a medical doctor who wants to change the way people, what they believe about health and nutrition. Peter Attia, glad to have you here.
Thanks very much for having me.
Could you just briefly tell your story, how you got into this and what's going on, what you have planned?
Yeah, well, you know, about 2 years ago I met the science journalist Gary Taubes, and by that point I'd already read his own work and already kind of done my own research on this problem for several years prior. And we met one day in a cafe somewhere in Berkeley, I believe, and we kind of discussed why his book wasn't having more of an impact. Why weren't people sort of able to sort of digest through all this science and start to at least question the conventional wisdom?
His book being Good Calories, Bad
Good
Calories.
Bad Calories in particular.
The message
is that the science supporting dietary recommendations was very weak, and that it was quite likely that the dietary recommendations that were being given to Americans, and by extension many people around the world, were actually untested or poorly tested.
Specifically
the recommendation that people shouldn't be consuming saturated fat, that they should be consuming 5 to 6 servings a day of whole grains, that the ideal diet consists of 60% carbohydrates. These things just didn't seem to have much evidence supporting them when you really looked at it. And so we asked this question, what could we do to have this revisited? Our first thought was actually to maybe put together an organization similar to the Cochrane collaboration, where we could get a number of thought leaders and experts to convene on the topic, review all of the available literature, do an even more exhaustive search than even what Gary had done, if that's possible, and issue sort of a consensus statement. And we kicked that idea around for a little while, but then decided, you know what, the only way this problem is going to be addressed is prospectively. In fact, as I didn't know at the time, but I've since learned, the Cochrane collaboration has already done that. In fact, the Cochrane collaboration in 2000 and 2006 issued remarkable consensus statements that asserted that there was no evidence that saturated fat was harmful. But obviously most people don't know that.
But people don't know it. People still believe that eating butter is going to kill them, right?
That's correct.
So how could you change that?
Well, I mean, maybe eating butter does kill people, but the point is there's no evidence to support it. So the only way to address this is to actually do the science going forward. So we decided to sort of create an organization, this organization that we've just launched, the Nutrition Science Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization that raises money not through industry, but only through private donors, public, the citizens of this world, who will want to put their money to funding good research. So our hypothesis was the following. What if you could get all of the best nutrition scientists in one room working on this problem? And you could provide a funding vehicle that would allow them to make this their highest priority. In other words, they wouldn't have to deal with a lot of the funding challenges that exist in conventional science today, and the resources could be made available that they could overcome all of the typical barriers to doing really exceptional metabolic science. Barriers such as the length of time that you can study these questions and the control you can have over human subjects, ability to monitor what they're consuming, and things like that. In many ways it's sort of like a Manhattan Project for nutrition science. So just as all the best and brightest physicists came to Los Alamos in 1942 to work on the most important physics problem of the day, what if we could do the same thing for the most important nutrition problem of the day?
But the Manhattan Project, making the A-bomb, that cost a lot of money, right?
It did. To put it in perspective, the Manhattan Project in 2010 dollars was $27 billion spent over just under 3 years. Now,
yeah, that's a lot.
That's a lot, but guess what? I believe that this problem can be resolved for something in the order of $600 to $700 million over 12 years. Now, before you say that's a heck of a lot of money, let's put that in perspective. Each year, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States approves about 44 drugs. Each year, 44 drugs get approved. The average cash cost, not the capitalized cost, the true out-of-pocket cash cost for developing each of those 44 drugs is about $873 million, according to a review article in Nature last year. So we're more than willing to spend nearly $1 billion for every drug we bring to market, something we do 44 times a year. Isn't it worth spending less than that just once on the single most important drug you and I will ever take? That drug that we take 3 times a day? Seems like a no-brainer to me.
That's a good argument. I guess the problem is that no one can make a lot of money from doing these studies, except perhaps government and saving on healthcare.
No, you're absolutely correct. There's an enormous economic argument that can be made here, and I'll make that in a moment. But you're right. We can never lose sight of the fact that pharma continues to spend $873 million on average per drug because it's profitable. They can make a return to their shareholders doing that. And what we're talking about is a very different problem. There's not money to be made in the same way, but there's a social gain. There's a social return on investment that more than transcends any economic return on investment. Now, we could put numbers to it just to trivialize it, right? So in the United States, every % reduction in obesity, where we sit at 34 to 34% today, every reduction in 1% of that reduces direct cost of healthcare by about $5.5 billion. That doesn't include the cost of lost productivity or other more subjective things. Every reduction in the every % reduction in the incidence of diabetes results in about a $27 billion reduction in the cost of spending. So, if you wanted to take the United States from where it is today to where it was the year I was born, so you're reducing obesity from about 34% to 15%, you're reducing diabetes from about 8% to 1.9%, just the savings from that alone in 1 year is about 100 times greater than what you'd need to spend to do this.
And this is not a saving that you get once, it's every year, forever, right?
That's the point. That's why it almost becomes silly to try to turn this into an economic argument, because if you really wanted to get technical and map out the economics of that with the present value of all those cash flows, it becomes nonsensical.
So why don't the government just give you that money?
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons that the government wouldn't just give us the money, and frankly, I don't think we need the government's money at this point. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a feeling here that the people of this country and around the world kind of want to take health in their own hands right now. And again, it's not an anti-government issue at all, right? I mean, I think the government really does want to do what is best. I really do believe that. But I also think there are a lot of entrenched interests right now, and there are a lot of agencies, and there's a lot of bureaucracy. And I think an organization like ours is so much more nimble and so much more able to just deploy funds and put them to work on the right questions, the strategic questions, regardless of, concern for what the outcome is.
So what is the first step?
Well, we've already been busy at work for several months. In fact, the first thing we did about 4 months ago was we convened a meeting of about 15 of the most well-respected researchers in this field. We met at the NIH, actually, in Bethesda, Maryland, and we just had a full-day session where we brainstormed out what the biggest questions and most important questions were that needed to be asked, and how would we go about asking them. And one of the things that was really exciting about that meeting was not only listening to these brilliant people put forth their ideas, many of which differed from my ideas or Gary's ideas or others' ideas, but it was watching over the course of the day as their own sort of boundary conditions or borders started to melt away. For example, a very common thing that you heard early in the day was, well, we can't do that, it would cost too much. That wouldn't work because it's too expensive. And I just kept sort of gently prodding the group to say, don't worry about that. Let's remove those constraints for a moment and just ask the question, what if? And once you sort of remove that constraint, you got to see just the amazing amount of creativity and problem solving that was brought to a problem that had previously been, put under the confines of tremendous scrutiny and basically a reduction in opportunity. And so we have a follow-up meeting coming up shortly. In fact, probably by the time this video airs, we will have had a follow-up meeting at NIH with the group of consortium scientists that are going to lead our first major funded study. And we have also been approached by a number of other fantastic investigators around the country who are studying various aspects of this problem, who are also interested in getting the type of funding that's necessary to make their studies truly exceptional. And these are funds, by the way, that just don't seem to be provided by the conventional funding entities.
So if we think about what's possible if you had, or this initiative had unlimited funds, what kind of science is like the dream?
Yeah,
project?
I mean, the dream study, you know, Andreas, would be the kind of thing that we think about for a long-term effectiveness study. You know, you have to think of these studies in two broad categories. You do efficacy studies where the goal is to understand the mechanism of action. These are the types of studies we think about in metabolic wards where, you know, typically these studies might be done for 4 weeks. I think with the types of resources we can bring to bear, we could do these studies for 6 months. We could make the living conditions so palatable and the food so palatable that you could actually, under very strict control, observe you know, human consumption over 6 months instead of 6 weeks. But those are these efficacy studies. So you are going to learn about the mechanism of action, and you will understand, you know, cause and effect more clearly. But ultimately, if you want to really impact human health, you need to do much longer studies, the so-called effectiveness studies. You need to be able to study people in a much more free-living environment, because at the end of the day, if you have science that says to do something and nobody can implement it, it's not necessarily that helpful. And so when you start to think about the major studies, the Women's Health Initiative, for example, where, you know, in that study you had 49,000 women followed for nearly 7 years, that's the kind of study that ultimately needs to be able to demonstrate that whatever was learned in these first studies is not only safe, but actually implementable. Now, typically those studies are really expensive and they're poorly done. It's the worst of both worlds because you have very little control over what people are doing, or at least you have very little ability to monitor what they're doing, and it's quite costly. If you threw cost away for a moment, you could do some pretty amazing stuff. Behavioral economics, for example. You could almost create a situation, kind of like the movie The Truman Show, where people live in sort of a world that looks and feels exactly like their world, but you can monitor everything. So you don't necessarily influence behavior, aside from providing, for example, the right information, but now you get to observe what are the economic trade-offs that people make. What are the choices people make? How does eating this impact doing that later on? And so, you know, we have a lot of these ideas that are in discussion right now, but right now we're really primarily focused on these first several studies that are going to be relatively smaller and more controlled and help us really elucidate mechanism of action.
So people watching this, where can they go to find out more about this? And if they want to help out in some way, get involved, what should they do?
Well, the first thing they should do is come to our website, which is nusi.org, N-U-S-I.org, and there'll be more information than anyone can digest there, and they can certainly get a sense of exactly what we're doing. Obviously, we're always going to be looking for donations. As I said, this is an organization that is funded entirely by the private citizens of the world, and not industry or anything like that. And there'll be opportunities for people to participate as well. You know, we might not have it up and running at the time this video airs originally, but ultimately we want to have a segment on there where people who want to get involved in projects can volunteer for projects as well. So we're really excited about this initiative, and you know, at the risk of stating the obvious, this has the potential to change the world.
I think so too. I think it's a very, very important initiative and with great potential. So I wish you best of luck.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for giving me a chance to talk about it.